Topic 2, macroeconomic fundamentals 2. The whole idea of topic 1 and 2 is to provide you with a nice, gentle overview of the main topics in macroeconomics and also financial markets, which is what the course is all about. So the first 2 weeks, you can almost consider it a mini macroeconomics course. We're covering some of the fundamental ideas, some of the fundamental policies that you will need later on in the course. And the main reason I'm starting the course off in this way, is so that we can start reading about what's going on in the real world at the moment. So this means I can provide you with newspaper articles, other readings about what's going on in the world right now. And by going through topics 1 and 2, hopefully you'll get a better understanding of what those articles are all about. But of course, by the end of the course, once we've gone through all of these concepts in detail, you'll have a very good understanding of what's going on in the real world. So that's the whole point of topics 1 and 2, just to get us started. Everything we cover in topics 1 and 2, we will revisit later on in the course in more detail. Okay, so topic 2.1, deflation. We've already spoken about inflation. This is the opposite, deflation. So deflation occurs when the average price level in an economy falls. And this is the case of Japan. So over here on the right, I've got from 1970 through to about 2018, 2019. It's hard to tell where the series ends. 2015 is that vertical dotted line there. So it looks like the series ends around about 2019. So we've got a long time series. At the top, we've got gross domestic product. Okay. Interestingly, gross domestic product, we expect that to just grow over time. Now, this would be real GDP. And we expect in most countries GDP to just get higher and higher every year, year after year after year. But look what happened from around about 1995 onwards in Japan. GDP fell. So they obviously went into a recession there. Then it rose, fluctuated a little bit, increased, but then it decreased a little bit. So from about 1995 through to about 2019, a period of almost a quarter of a century, GDP in Japan hardly changed. That's pretty remarkable, because if I was to get data for Australia over that same time period, you would see our path of GDP sort of increasing and just steadily rising. GDP per capita. This is a good proxy of income per capita, which to some extent does affect a person's living standards. So you'll have to trust me for now, but GDP and total income in an economy, highly correlated. Virtually the same thing, let's just put it that way. So not only did GDP just stagnate from 1995 onwards, but GDP per capita did as well. So that is output, the value of output per person. It's also income per person, you can think of it that way. Imagine over from 1995 onwards through to about 2019, a situation where your income doesn't change. That certainly hasn't happened in Australia. People are earning much more in terms of income than they did back in 1995. But Japan's a remarkable situation in a very bad way. The other thing that's happening that is sort of consistent, perfectly consistent with this period of economic stagnation, is very low inflation. So visually, just imagine it as the aggregate demand curve permanently being to the left, spending in the economy permanently being low. If spending is low, then production will be low. Companies are not going to produce output, produce GDP, if spending is low. So when I see a series like this and GDP is just stagnating over time, I immediately think to myself, well, the only way output can stagnate, and output, GDP is a measure of output, is if spending is stagnating as well. And so if the aggregate demand curve is to the left, then, and I don't need to be too precise about what I mean when I say to the left. I sort of just mean the aggregate demand curve has perhaps shifted a little bit to the left of where it would normally be if the economy was in better health. So all I'm trying to say there by saying that the aggregate demand curve is a little bit to the left is spending is low, spending growth is low. And so this coincides, this stagnation of GDP and GDP per capita corresponds to very low inflation. When the economy was growing steadily, the inflation rate in Japan was around about 2 to 3 to 4%. But then something happened in the early 1990s and growth stalled. And it led the economy to experience very low inflation, even quite a few years, and I'm looking at these red columns now, of deflation. That's falling prices. So when we talk about deflation, we don't have to have deflation every single year. We just need to have deflation be frequent enough so that on average, the inflation rate's pretty much close, or the average inflation rate is pretty close to zero. So I would never expect, if a country's experiencing deflation, I would never expect to see from 1995 onwards, red columns indicating negative growth in the average CPI. So this is the Consumer Price Index, the growth rate of the CPI. It indicates the rate of change in prices. The green columns, a positive growth rate in the average price level, and the red columns, a negative growth rate in the average price level. So I'd never expect to see just solid columns. That would mean over a period of, how many years are we talking about? About 24 years, that every year the price level just fell and fell and fell. And the economy would just be moving into oblivion if that happened. It's very unrealistic to think that that would ever happen. But this is as close to, well, this is a very good example of deflation. As I said, we've got 6 red columns here. Don't worry about this one. That was just an aberration. Just one drop in the price level over, well, that looks like 1974. But it was surrounding by very strong growth or very strong inflation. But it's this period here. As I said, you don't need every column being red. You just need a situation where there is enough years of deflation so that the average inflation rate is very, very close to zero. And so I would look at this period in Japan since about 1995 and think to myself, well, inflation was so low over that period, including some years in which deflation occurred, that all of the costs of deflation, all of the theoretical costs of deflation would have been incurred in Japan over this period. So hopefully that makes sense. I guess the final question in this slide is what caused this very low inflation? That is, what caused this very low growth in GDP? And the answer is over here on the left-hand side of this slide. We've got a price index of real estate in Japan. So this index here is an index of average house prices in Japan. And we've got the Nikkei 225, which is an index of stock prices here down the bottom. What you can see is this incredible growth in housing prices, apartment prices in Japan. So the index started at around about, what does that look like? About 30, and the index went up to about 220. So from 1980 to about 1990, a 10-year period, we've got house prices, apartment prices in Japan, increasing by a factor of 7 to 8 times. That's incredible. The stock market went from an index of 8,000 over the same period to about 40 at the peak. That's a 5 times increase in stock prices. So we're talking about a massive increase in both stocks and real estate prices. Now, I won't go into it in too much detail, but the only thing that can cause growth of asset prices of this magnitude is massive borrowing by investors from banks. So they're borrowing money and just pouring this borrowed money into the stock market and into the real estate market. And if you want to go back and read about this event in Japan, more than welcome. We're not going to go into it in detail in this course. I'm just pointing out that this happened. I'm not going to go into the reasons why it happened in this course, but it certainly did happen. But then the thing of interest to us is the reversal of asset prices. You can see something happened in the early 1990s, and it led to an absolute collapse of real estate prices. It led to an absolute collapse of stock market prices. In fact, over this period, this run up in housing prices from 1980 to 1990, I had a colleague that I worked with for a while. He was from Japan, and he owned a property in Tokyo. He bought it in the late 1970s, I think he told me, 78, 79. He paid $500,000 for this apartment. Over the next 10 years, the price of that apartment, the market price of that apartment went from $500,000 to $5 million. So his apartment went up by a factor of 10 times. Now, I did ask him, did you sell it at the peak? And he said no. He sort of shook his head and said, no, I didn't. And he just watched prices tumble back down. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the price increases that were occurring there. So a lot of people were feeling very, very wealthy. Whether you owned an apartment, whether you owned stocks or both, in the 1980s, you would have been feeling like an absolute king surrounded by gold. You would have been feeling that you were just getting wealthy every week, every month. Now, I'm not going to go through what caused this reversal of asset prices, but we do need to think about the consequences of this. Think about it yourself. You're living in Japan, in Tokyo. You're living in an apartment. You bought the apartment in the early 1980s, and you also borrowed money. Well, you borrowed money to buy the apartment. You borrowed money to buy the stocks as well. Or maybe you paid cash. It doesn't really matter. But then over the next 10 years, you watch the value of your apartment just explode. It just goes through the roof. The value of your stock portfolio increases by a factor of 5 times. And so you're feeling on top of the world. And then all of a sudden, that prices start collapsing. Now, maybe you did sell at the peak. And good for you if you did. But you'd probably agree with me that a lot of people wouldn't have done that. So a lot of people would have just stayed living in their apartment. They would have their money locked away in maybe superannuation, where they can't sell the stocks and take the money out. Or maybe other people held stocks thinking that the fall was just temporary and they were going to rise, but instead of rising back up, these stock prices just kept falling and falling and falling. A lot of people just wouldn't have sold. And even if you had sold early on, you would have just transferred the problem to someone else. If you had sold your stocks at the peak here, then rather than you taking the loss, it would have been the new owner taking the loss. So someone's got to take the loss. But just imagine that you hold an apartment, you hold stocks, and you just watch the prices collapse, collapse, and collapse. What are you going to do? What impact is that going to have on you psychologically? As a homeowner, as a worker, as a member of society? What impact is it? And this is the important question. What impact is it going to have, this drop in asset prices, on the amount of money you spend each week? Would you tighten your belt? Would you save more? Now, maybe some of you are thinking, no, I wouldn't save anymore as a result of this. And you may have some good reasons for that. But the fact is, enough people respond to this sort of collapse in asset prices by increasing their savings and therefore reducing their consumption to shift the aggregate demand curve substantially to the left. And this certainly happened over the early 1990s. As prices continued to collapse, the aggregate demand curve just weakened and weakened and weakened. And that's just a fancy way of saying that people cut back on the amount that they spend because their personal wealth was just sort of fading away. So they cut back on their spending, increased their savings. The aggregate demand curve was kind of nudging to the left. And of course, from 1995 onwards, we really began to see the Japanese economy just stagnating. GDP basically just didn't grow at all. As I said, you may not respond to this fall in asset prices by increasing your savings and reducing your consumption, but enough people will to ensure that this sort of asset price collapse has a substantial impact on overall spending, mainly consumption spending, because we know that aggregate demand is made up of C, I, G, and NX. What I'm suggesting here is this is going to cause an immediate drop in consumption spending as people try to save more and repair their balance sheet. Also, fear of the unknown would cause more people to save, or people to save more. Asset prices are collapsing, what's ahead? So people get very, very nervous when this sort of thing happens. So I'd expect consumption spending to fall. With housing prices, apartment prices collapsing, I would expect investment in the housing industry to stall. If people aren't buying houses, there's no purpose of building them, so investment spending would fall. So at the very least, in terms of aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus NX, we would expect C to fall, we would expect I to fall. So that's the story of Japan. Next thing we have to figure out is, why is deflation a disaster? Generally, deflation is deflation can actually be an indication that an economy is in a severe recession or a depression, or it can actually push an economy into a recession. Okay, so it's a bit like the chicken and the egg, which comes first? Sometimes an economy will go into a recession and deflation will then occur. You can just, hopefully you can visualize that. If the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left enough, output, real GDP on the horizontal axis, will begin to fall. The economy can then go into a technical recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in GDP. And if that recession is deep enough and prolonged enough, then deflation can result. However, it's important to realize that sometimes deflation, that is a period of, technically deflation is negative inflation, but now I'm kind of broadening the definition, and I'm kind of thinking in my own mind, deflation as being a period of let's say zero inflation or very minimal inflation. So sometimes you can have an economy growing quite nicely over time. So GDP growth is reasonably strong, 2 to 3%, and then something causes deflation to occur. And we can talk about that, what that could be later on in the course. But deflation occurs. And for some of these reasons I've got below, that can then result in a recession. Okay, so in summary, sometimes a recession will lead to deflation, other times deflation will lead to a recession. But once again, I've said this numerous times, a nice gentle introduction to this topic. You'll be reading more about inflation, deflation later on in the course, and really sort of understanding it well. So deflation. Why is deflation such a disaster? First of all, it means that consumers can comfortably delay their consumption spending. If you're in a situation where you expect consumer prices of goods and services to fall next year, and maybe the year after, or maybe just not increase, then it's very easy for you to delay your consumption spending, because you know next year the prices of what you want to buy might be a little bit lower. Now, of course, you can't do that with things like food and electricity. You need those sorts of goods right now. But if you're thinking about buying, a new car, a new mountain bike, new sports equipment, then very often with those sorts of purchases, which are delayable purchases, you can delay them. And so if you think that a car or a mountain bike might be 3-4% cheaper in 6 months' time because of deflation, you may then just delay your consumption spending. And if enough people think that way, if enough people just wait and don't spend now because they think that prices might be cheaper in the future, that can have a very big impact on the aggregate demand curve and cause very slow or negative growth in real GDP. So having inflation rather than deflation, having inflation encourages people to keep their wallets and their purses open, and just encourages them to keep spending. Okay, so that's one of the benefits of inflation. There's no reason not to buy today because prices will be a little bit higher tomorrow. Of course, once again, I'm not talking about any individual good or service. I'm talking about prices across the board on average. So when we're sort of talking about inflation, deflation, you can't be thinking about individual prices. Sure, you might have the certain good or service that you're thinking about buying, and even in a period of inflation, the price of that may be falling. That's fine. And you may then delay your consumption spending until the price of that good comes down a little bit. I do that myself, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about prices across the entire economy falling, not just one or two goods that you may be interested in buying. That's not deflation. That's something different. Okay, second, cost of deflation, high real interest rates during recessions. Now, you're going to have to go back to that equation in topic 1. Nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate plus the inflation rate. In that example in topic 1, the nominal interest rate, we set that at a low level of 2%. If you have negative inflation, a negative number in terms of inflation, it implies a very high real interest rate. So you're going to have to go back to that equation, nominal interest rate equals real interest rate plus the inflation rate, to actually convince yourself of that. And in the last topic, I certainly did talk about deflation, negative inflation, causing very high real interest rates. So if you have deflation, if the nominal interest rate can go no lower than 2%, and that's, say, the nominal interest rate on mortgages, it implies a very high real interest rate when you have deflation. That makes monetary policy very effective. At the same time, there's little incentive for firms to invest. So just imagine you're a company, let's just say you're running a restaurant. Then you're thinking about expanding the restaurant and putting in more seats. But now the economy, and you have to borrow money to do that. Let's say you have to borrow $500,000 to expand this restaurant, fully fit it out, train up new staff, et cetera, et cetera. But now the economy is hit with deflation. And so prices are either not rising or falling. And let's just imagine that to stay competitive, you have to start slowly lowering the prices of the meals that you offer in your restaurant. Of course, that's going to shrink your profits. It's going to make it very, very difficult. Then the question is, would you be willing to borrow $500,000 to expand your restaurant when the prices of what you're serving your customers, what you're selling your customers, are falling? If you're saying, yes, I would be willing to do that, you're braver than me. Good for you, because I wouldn't do it. So, the idea I'm trying to get across is that deflation, falling prices, if you're running a business, it's going to make it you're going to be very reluctant, generally speaking, to borrow money and invest in your business. So not only will consumption likely to be quite weak, investment spending will be quite weak as well in number 2. Also, it increases the real value of debt. Once again, let's just imagine you're a business and you've got a $1 million debt, a $1 million loan, and you took out the money to establish the business, get up operations up and running. And now deflation hits. And so the prices of what you sell to your customers are slowly either stagnating or slowly falling. Let's just assume a severe case and assume that the prices are now actually falling each year by 1-2% every year. The problem with that is what you're selling, the prices of what you're selling is falling and your revenue is falling as well. But that $1 million that you borrowed to get the business up and running, that doesn't fall. You're still going to have to pay that same $1 million back to the bank. Unfortunately, the banks don't decrease your debt during periods of deflation. So you'll still have the $1 million to pay back the bank, but you'll have this shrinking pool of revenue with which to service that debt and pay back the principal. Okay, another problem of deflation. And number 4, increases in real wages occur as nominal wages are often sticky downwards. So we've seen this equation before. The real wage equals the nominal wage divided by the price level. Now, the nominal wage is your money wage. Let's just say that your nominal wage is $100,000 a year. I'll pick a nice round number, $100,000 a year. And then what happens is the business that you're working for, because deflation's hit the economy, that business needs to then reduce the prices of the goods or services that it sells to its customers. And so the price level is falling, maybe 2 or 3% each year. Extreme example, just to get the point across. When I say an extreme example, I mean the assumption that prices are falling 2 to 3% each year. That's pretty extreme. But we'll work with that assumption because it just, I think it's quite useful because it really just makes this example much clearer, I think. So where were we? Nominal wage, you're getting paid $100,000 a year, but the price level of the goods and services that your company sells is now falling. That means your real wage is going up. So relative to the prices of the goods and services your company is selling, your nominal wage is becoming more and more expensive. And that's likely to then cause your firm to cut back the amount of workers they employ, or maybe discourage them from employing new people. And if the real wage is going up, then it's reducing the profitability of your company's operations, and it may actually shift their supply curve, their individual firm supply curve to the left a little bit, and reduce the amount that they are willing to sell at the current price level. Because simply with real wages going up, it's not as profitable to sell anymore. So as prices go down, real wages go up, and firms may very well cut back the level of output because the higher real wages are a cost of production to the firm, so their profitability falls, so they may well cut back the amount they produce and supply into the market, which will then mean that the unemployment rate may well increase. Okay, one final point before we end this video, because the next slide is on interest rates, 2.2, and I'll record a separate video. But just for now, you may be wondering, well, if the price level is falling by, say, 2% a year, why can't nominal wages fall by 2% per year so that the real wage is roughly constant? Well, there's a lot has been written about that in the macroeconomics literature over the last 30 or 40 years. And one of the key conclusions is this. Technically, it would be possible for nominal wages to fall, for businesses to go to workers and say, we are going to cut your wages by 2% because the price level is falling by 2%. However, the concern of firms in doing that would be the response of workers. Let's just imagine that happened to you. You're working for a company, you're getting paid $100,000 a year, and then deflation occurred. And so over a particular year, everyone expected the price level to fall by 2%. So your boss came along and said, as a result of this expected deflation of 2%, we're going to have to cut your nominal wage from 100,000 to 98,000, 2% decline. How would you respond to that? There's been a lot of research done on this. Some people may be quite happy to accept it, and sort of their response might be, well, yeah, that makes sense. If it means saving my job, I'll do it. But the concern among many businesses is that if they ask their workers to take cuts to their nominal wage, productivity might fall. Company loyalty might fall. The best workers may actually find a job at a similar company, another company that does or produces similar goods or services, but at the old higher wage rate of 100,000. So you may get people leaving the firm. And so with a potential loss of employees, loss of productivity, loss of staff morale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's very difficult for companies to cut nominal wages to maintain their real wage. Now, it doesn't mean that that doesn't happen. There's been plenty of examples of, in recent times, of companies and workers agreeing to wage increases which are below the inflation rate, so that real wages do fall. So there are examples of that at the individual company or organisation level, but not all companies will do that. And the companies that choose to maintain their nominal wage, the fact remains, when its price level falls, real wages go up, and it puts a lot of pressure on those companies, and it puts a lot of pressure on those companies' ability to retain and employ new workers, their profitability, and their ability to supply output to the market. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We've got 4 very good reasons why deflation is an absolute disaster. So what you may want to do is do a little bit more reading about the costs of deflation. I've got 4 there, but I think if you do your own research, you don't have to do a lot of research on deflation. I'm talking about a quick search and maybe just sort of 5-10 minutes reading on the costs of deflation, just to reinforce what I've said and perhaps just get a different perspective on deflation from a different source. I think that would be quite useful. And really, you should be doing that throughout the course. I encourage people to read widely and go outside of the boundaries of the course. So if you find something particularly interesting, like deflation, do a little bit of reading about it. Find countries that have experienced deflation in the past and find out what the author's perspective is on the causes and the consequences of that deflation. Deflation has occurred in numerous countries around the world, so there's a lot out there to read.